Now what I have today is a Leica Lights Canada Summicron-R f2 50mm lens. So this is a German lens made by Leica that was assembled and manufactured in Canada in the 1960s. This style of lens is actually still sought after, as filmmakers will use this lens on digital camera bodies. This lens is actually a 3-cam version, which means it's usable on most Leica R-style camera bodies. Here I'm just playing with the focus knob on this lens, which is still buttery smooth. It feels like I'm turning a Nest Home thermostat. The lens shroud is also easily extended and retracted, and the aperture ring works perfectly fine. So I picked up this lens on eBay for around $400 Canadian. This may seem like a lot, but these lenses can go for $1,000 easily. The one problem with this lens is the internal elements have a huge amount of debris and fungus. So obviously the reason I was able to pick this up so cheap is that Leica would charge you an arm and a leg to get this thing cleaned out. You could send this to a private cleaner as well, but I'm sure they would charge you the same amount. In this video, I'm going to attempt to take this thing apart and clean out all this fuzz and debris. It should be a fun process, but we'll see how it goes. You can really see here how bad it actually is. But I guess the first thing we're going to want to do is take this thing apart. Now that was a little unfair, so let me go back and show you how I actually got this thing taken apart. The first thing we're going to want to do is take off this front cosmetic cover. It seems like I've lost the footage of me taking off this cosmetic ring, but I've just simply popped it off with the tweezers. Once the cover was removed, there was actually a hidden grub screw that I just simply unscrewed. So this front lens shroud actually has no features to unscrew with. So what I actually ended up doing was using an O-ring and an old soldering iron spool, and I just used the force of friction to unscrew this front shroud. Once it was loose, it just kind of came off. So here you can see that front shroud. It seems to be made out of aluminum, and it's really well made. It's super lightweight, but it feels very robust. The lens assembly seems to be held in place with these retaining nuts that have slotted features on either end. Now you could go ahead and buy an expensive tool to unscrew this, but I'm going to use an old pair of verniers. Now don't go using your dad's NIST calibrated Mitutoyo vernier for this, as you'll only end up being more of a disappointment in his eyes. I'm using this old vernier I had laying around, which I use for dumb projects like this. You can pick up a vernier like this on Amazon for like 10 or 20 bucks. It's really nice because you can adjust the size for all the different size retaining nuts that are in this lens. It seems like all of them are different sizes. I was able to get the primary retaining nut off very easily, but this secondary nut seemed to be really tough. I've never taken a lens like this apart before, so I just went in and made sure that the thread was right hand and that there was no other grub screw hidden in the back end of this camera. I did notice there was a little bit of thread locker, so I went and grabbed some nail polish remover with a high acetone content, hoping that this would dissolve the thread locker. I applied a good amount of acetone or nail polish remover to this thread locker, hoping that it would dissolve. But even with that acetone applied, I couldn't seem to get this nut loose. So my next option was to apply a little bit of heat. I grabbed my soldering iron and cleaned off the solder, and was looking to just apply a little bit of heat to the thread locker region. I didn't want to apply too much heat because I didn't know if this would screw up the lens. Once I thought it was nice and toasty, I gave it another go with the verniers, and I still had no luck. I decided to grab a pair of rubber gloves and just grasp the lens as firmly as I could and apply as much force as possible. This seemed kind of stupid, but it actually worked really well. You can see the whole table kind of shake. I had to put a whole lot of force to get this thing loose. I'm not sure if the acetone, the heat, or me just reefing it as hard as I could actually got it loose, but I'm glad it came out. Once that retaining ring was removed, there's actually another smaller one hidden behind that larger retaining ring. I just grabbed the vernier again, and this one loosened up real easy. Once I had broken the seal with the vernier, I went in with the forceps just to quickly unscrew it. Nothing special here, just the same as the ones before, just a different size. Once I had that retaining ring removed, I just checked to see if there's anything else holding these lenses in place, and there weren't. So I gave it a quick tap on the table, and this front lens element just popped right out. Here I was shining a light to see if, how much fungus or how much material is actually built up on it. And the front lens actually didn't look too bad. It was actually in pretty good condition. Here, now that I had the front element off, I was able to see the rear element. And so what I tried doing was just using a microfiber cleaning cloth and a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and just tried to wipe away some of the fungus in there. I put very little pressure and used a very small amount of isopropyl alcohol, and it didn't seem to do anything. I really didn't want to damage the lens, so I was really careful with this. I tried applying more pressure with the microfiber cleaning cloth and using a little bit more rubbing alcohol, but I didn't seem to get any good results. Here you can see how bad this rear element really is. It kind of looks like frost on a windshield. I figured I couldn't get away with just cleaning the lens in this state, so I had to take it apart further. I noticed two little holes back here that I could use my vernier and try to unscrew this rear retaining nut. So here I'm just lining up the calipers again to the two two holes to loosen it up. At this point, you can actually pinpoint the moment where I realized I needed to get a second pair of pants. Right as it falls out, you can see me just kind of flabbergasted. That wasn't supposed to happen, and so I thought I had broken the lens. You could see me here just looking at everything, making sure everything works properly. This was kind of startling, but everything was totally fine. And near the end of the video, you'll see how it's actually reassembled, and this is not a problem at all. I just took a moment here to make sure everything was functioning properly and just reassuring myself that I hadn't broken anything. The lens body seemed fine, and this main element assembly also seemed to be working perfectly fine. Here you can see I'm opening the aperture just to see if if I broke anything, but it seemed to all be in one piece. So I tried again with the verniers, got them set to the right size. Once I broke the seal with the vernier, I again just used the forceps to remove the retaining ring. There actually is a little spring steel washer that goes between the retaining ring and the lens element. I assume that's to prevent it from being scratched while you're tightening it. But once that was loose, I just popped out the rear element. You can see the whole aperture mechanism working. It's pretty neat. Once I had that out, I then rubbed it a lot more vigorously with isopropyl alcohol on microfiber cleaning cloth. You can see now I'm really not being too careful with it. After messing around a little earlier and doing this for a little while, I realized the lens elements are actually really tough and they're not going to get scratched that easily. Here you can see it's getting a little bit better, but it's really not that great. What I decided to do was actually take this to the sink and wash it with warm water and soap. The soap seemed to work really well, and afterwards I actually washed it further with just soap. Here you can see some particles, but this is just dust, so don't focus too much on that. Take a look at the actual haze and the frost-like fungus. Here I realized the lens elements actually are made up of two separate lenses, so I'm just taking apart the front element. With those in two pieces now, I can clean each lens individually and hopefully get a better result. So here I've washed all of the lenses with soapy water. It wasn't anything different than what I was doing before, just with with soap as opposed to isopropyl alcohol. Now that I've actually got this all cleaned up, I'm actually using a little bit more alcohol to try to clean away any of the soap that's left over or any sediment left from the water. I'm just shining it under a flashlight here to see if I can find any haze. At this point, I'm not too concerned about dust. I mean, there's going to be dust everywhere. So I'm just looking at fungus, haze, anything that's kind of big and splotchy, fingerprints. The dust will definitely get cleaned off a little later. I'm just using a small circular motion from the center of the lens outward, and this seemed to be working pretty well to get rid of any smudges or fingerprints. So here you can see the lens is looking pretty nice. Again, there are little splotches of dust, but it's nothing to worry about at this point. The front element didn't seem to be in too bad of a condition, so I just gave it a little rinse with soap and water, and then again just isopropyl alcohol. Once I was happy with the alcohol cleaning, I actually started to clean the lenses with just my breath. The alcohol left a large amount of streaks, whereas me just breathing on the lens and rubbing it with a microfiber seemed to leave no residue. I know some people who are really into lenses and really into expensive gear are cringing right now, but honestly, this works really well. I also cleaned in a small circular pattern from the inside out, and I just didn't see any residue, didn't have any smears, any smudges, and it was just a really good way of getting these lenses clean. I mean, after washing them with my bare hands under soap and water, I was really confident these guys wouldn't get scratched unless I was acting really stupid. You can see here how nice the lens looks after soap, isopropyl alcohol, and then me breathing on this lens. Here I was just putting it back together to see if there was any other problems. Again, they're just little pieces of dust which aren't anything to worry about at this point. This rear element is the most sensitive element in this camera lens assembly. You can see that there's still a fair amount of haze and fungus left, so I'm going to give it a second wash with soap and water. Once that was done, you can see here there's a fair bit of fibers from the paper towel I used to clean it off, but it totally was fine. There's no more haze, but there is a fair bit of dust. So at this point I put on some rubber gloves and I was looking to get rid of the last little pieces of dust that were stuck on the lens. Again, I'm just exhaling onto the lens and cleaning in small circular patterns from the inside out. This works remarkably well, and I mean, if you want to spend the money and buy better solutions or to use PEC pads or Kim wipes, that's totally up to you. But for me, breathing on it and just rubbing it with a microfiber cleaning cloth seemed to work just fine. I did try lens cleaner as well, but I didn't really get any good results. I still got streaks and smudges, whereas me just breathing on the lenses seemed to work perfectly. So here you can see there's a lot of dust on that lens, and I'm going to just go ahead and try to get it off with this cloth. Here you can see it's pretty good. I'm just wiping away the last little bits of dust with my finger, but it's definitely a lot better than just using eyeglass cleaner or isopropyl alcohol. So here's where being kind of dumb actually pays off. I decided to get a lint roller and actually lint roll the tabletop as well as the microfiber cleaning cloth I was using. This seemed to remove a lot of the little bits of dust, and I was able to get the lens actually a lot cleaner. I haven't come across anyone on the internet who's using a lint roller on a microfiber cleaning cloth to clean lenses, but it seems to work really well. I'm not sure if it's just because the lint roller is picking up all the little bits of dust, or perhaps the rolling the lint roller over the microfiber cloth is charging it so that all these little particles stick to the fiber cloth a little easier. Here you can see how much better the rear element actually looks. Again, there are bits of dust, but don't worry about that too much. Just focus on the haze and the fungus-like structure. Again, I just kept breathing on these lenses and rubbing them with the microfiber cloth until a lot of the dust was gone. Once I was kind of happy with the results, I put it back together, and I just wanted to see what it would look like under the light. Didn't look too bad. Good enough for the girls I go out with. And so the front element was the exact same, looked pretty decent, so I was pretty happy with the results at this point. Leaps and bounds better than what we had before, but of course, you could get this a little better. At this point, I just got all the parts ready for reassembly. There really weren't that many parts, and I think even if I was twice as dumb as I am, I could probably still put this camera back together. Here I'm just cleaning these spring steel elements with isopropyl alcohol so that any fungus that was left over wouldn't regrow. I'm just gently pushing these spring steel washers back in place with the forceps. Again, I'm just verifying that the lenses don't have any other dust between the two elements. There definitely is still a little bit of dust on the front and back side, but if the dust in between is gone, we should be fine. Here I'm putting the retaining nut back on, and again I'm just threading with my hands, and then once it gets into position I'll go ahead and use the verniers to tighten it up all the way. For this application, these verniers work really well. I don't know if I'd want to use snap ring pliers. You may accidentally scratch the lens elements. The amount of torque I'm applying to this nut is approximately the same as to what it took to take it apart. I'm not sure if this is the right amount, but it definitely is a logical thing to do. I mean, if the glass was fine with a torque that was applied previously, I don't want to overdo it, and I definitely don't want to underdo it. Here I'm just taking one last look at the lenses, and you know, in a process like this, if you're not happy with the results at this point, you might as well start over. So the rear element, in my opinion, did not look that good. I've already spent a fair amount of time working on getting these lenses clean, so I brought the lint roller and the microfiber cloth back out, and I wanted to give this another go to try to get rid of any particles that were in there. Here I just take the front lens off and go back in with my breathing technique in the small circles. It seemed to work pretty well on the front element, but this rear element just for some reason was a lot dirtier. Again, I'm wearing gloves here, obviously just to prevent me from putting any fingerprints or smudges on the lenses. Again, I'm not too concerned about scratching these guys with my fingertips. Here again, just exhaling and going in small circles trying to get any dust off. I did lint roll this microfiber cloth a few times during this process. At this point I had spent a few hours actually trying to clean these lenses, so I wasn't going to put the assembly back together until I was really happy with the whole with the cleaning of the lenses. Here you can see it looks a lot better. It looks really nice actually. Again, there's a little bit of dust, but what are you going to do? I mean, I'm doing this in my bedroom. Things aren't going to be perfect. Here I'm just going to reassemble the lens, I guess, body. It kind of looks like a little telescope. So I just put the lens back in and made sure the aperture blades are functioning properly. I then cleaned the retaining rings and the washers with isopropyl alcohol just to make sure that there wasn't any fungus remaining that would regrow. Again, I'm just threading these on by hand. I'll get most of the way done with the forceps, and then I'll go ahead and finish it up with the verniers. Again, the amount of torque I'm applying to these retaining nuts are pretty much the same as what it took to take them apart. This may be a bit silly, but I mean, it is the only thing I can really work off of at this point. I'm just checking to see if the aperture blades will still function properly, and just looking to see if any more dust is in that inner element. The front element is looking pretty clean as well, so I decided just to put that back into position. This element was a lot cleaner than the rear element when we started taking this apart, so it does make sense that it was a little bit easier to clean. Here I'm just positioning the lens element into the lens shroud, and then I'm going to add the retaining ring in to tighten into its final position. Again, just checking one last time to make sure everything's looking good, and as you can see, it looks fantastic. Honestly, not bad for a microfiber cleaning cloth and just breathing on these inner lens elements. I'm not sure if cleaning every lens will be this easy, but this one seemed to be going pretty well. So this was probably the trickiest part of the entire repair, the assembly and disassembly of this lens shroud into this lens body. The aperture blades on the shroud locate on this feature on the inside of this lens body. I just set the lens here to f2, which would mean that the aperture would be completely open, and then I went ahead and tried to insert the shroud into the lens body. I just had to try to line up the aperture blade on the shroud with the mating feature on the lens body. I kind of inserted and twisted so that when it was in its final position, the aperture blade would be completely open. Once it was looking pretty good, I just put a little bit of pressure and it sat right where it needed to. Here you can see it's actually working pretty well. This did take me a few tries to get right, so take your time with this as well. When I was happy with the final position of the shroud inside the lens body, I went and checked the aperture sizes with a different lens to see if the sizes actually matched up. The aperture sizes seemed to match up, so I went ahead with final assembly. This was the retaining ring that was Loctited or thread locked into position. I decided not to put more thread locker on this, as even when I was threading it in by hand, it did seem to be a little tough, and that's probably just from residual thread locker. I also wanted to make sure that I could take this apart later in case these lenses weren't cleaned properly. Here again, I'm just torquing it real tight. This retaining ring seemed to be the load-bearing retaining ring, and so I really wanted to torque it properly. Here you can see I'm applying a lot of pressure, but that's really how tight it was when I took it apart. Once that retaining ring was nice and tight, I went ahead and added the final cosmetic retaining ring. I think this is mostly to prevent light from reflecting into the lens. You can actually see here that there's a small silver dot, and that's where the grub screw that we took off in the first step actually registers to. It may look like I'm applying a lot of force, but I'm just ensuring that the downward pressure is equal to the rotary pressure so I don't get any slippage. Once I have that retaining ring in position, I then bring out the lens shroud assembly. This guy was a little dirty, so I went ahead and washed it with some isopropyl alcohol as well. And once I was ready, I just positioned it onto the body and began threading it into position. I did mark the position of that silver hole with my forceps, just a small little scratch just to know exactly where it was. There was nowhere to actually grab this with a vernier to tighten, so I did have to bring out the O-ring and my soldering iron spool to friction twist this into position. And so I just kept trying to turn this until that grub screw hole lined up with that grub screw register on the last retaining nut. Once it was in position, I brought out that little grub screw and then just began to thread in position. This grub screw wasn't on too tight. I'm pretty sure it's just here just to prevent anything from coming loose. It's just to add a bit of security. And so I just put that into position. Out of everything in this camera, this is probably the only part you should really worry about. If you lost this, I think you'd have a really hard time trying to find a replacement. Here I'm just taking the front-facing plate and I'm scraping off the bits of glue that were left on from when it was first assembled. This glue is pretty crap. It seemed to come off pretty easy. But I mean, what can you expect from like 60-year-old glue? I'm not too concerned about scratching this element as it seems to be some sort of anodized aluminum. And so I'm just going at it with a knife and taking off any high points of glue. I did the exact same thing for the lens shroud, which I probably should have done prior to assembling the whole camera, but at this point I was pretty excited to get the whole thing back together. If you are silly like me and you've decided to scrape off the glue while the lens is fully assembled, make sure you take your time. You don't really want to mess anything up at this point since it's all kind of coming together. Here you can see that little bit of white glue and powder that's coming off. And I'm just making sure to clean this off between scraping sessions so I don't get any glue onto the lens. Here I'm just putting the lens onto the camera body so that I could know exactly where it would be sitting when it's in its home position. Here I'm clicking the depth of field preview and it seems to be working just fine, which is really reassuring. So this lens cap says Lights Canada, and so I wanted to make sure that that was in the correct orientation, was glued in position. So here I'm just getting it in a nice spot, and then I'm just gonna go in and rub the areas with isopropyl alcohol. You may not know this, but the type of glue you use doesn't really matter. What's more important is having an extremely clean surface. So here, cleaning with isopropyl alcohol is all you really need with the super glue. And as Fred Flintstone would say, a little dab will do ya. So I'm just putting a little bit of super glue here. I'm gonna get this cosmetic ring lined up correctly. Once I was happy with the position, I just dropped it into place, and it adhered pretty quickly. I went in and just wanted to put a even pressure while it was curing. So I patted it down with my fingers and then used the O-ring and the soldering iron spool to actually apply a little bit of pressure. Here it may look like I'm applying a lot of load, but I'm just putting a decent amount just to keep it in position while it's curing. This video is sped up, so I was holding it here for a little while. And yeah, once that was in position, seemed to work perfectly fine. And we turned this hot garbage lens into something that's actually pretty usable. And I think anyone would be happy owning. Hopefully you liked that video, and thanks for watching.